They said I make her uncomfortable when I let myself in with my key, to the house I gave them as a wedding gift, the house whose front steps I painted with my own hands so the photographs would look warm and welcoming, the house that looked back at me last Thursday, like a stranger who had already decided not to help. I'm 80 now, living in a modest one-bedroom above a tailor's shop that closes at 6 and leaves the hallway smelling faintly of steam and chalk and warm fabric. And I suppose this is the part where I tell you I'm fine and resourceful and not easily rattled. But the truth is, that sentence unstitched me in a slow, deliberate way, not like a dramatic tear down the center, but the quiet pick, pick, pick of a seam ripper you don't see until the hem drops around your ankles. I was standing in their foyer when my son delivered it in the tone he uses for medical instructions and weather advisories, the careful, reasonable tone that tells you you're wrong without ever using the word. And he didn't meet my eyes because he had memorized a script and was afraid he'd forget his lines. And so I looked past his shoulder at the framed print of a pier vanishing into fog and thought how appropriate it was to decorate a life with distance and call it art. He said, "Mom, it's not personal," which is what people announce when they have bundled your heart into a policy manual. And then, "Caroline needs boundaries now that the baby's here." And I nodded, because women of my generation nod the first time we are dismissed, and sometimes the second, because we were trained to tidy the mess other people make of our dignity and do it without clattering the bin. And I placed the soup I had carried over, a heavy pot with barley and carrots, and the last of the dill from my tiny balcony planter, on their counter without scraping it against the marble. And I did not remind him that those counters exist because I liquidated the municipal bonds his father left me. And I did not point to the fine vertical scratches from the night they dragged a crate across the island without lifting. And I did not say that my key was not a trespass, but a promise, a metal proof of love shaped to fit. Because none of that cashiers in a house that has learned to count only appearances. When a woman like me says, "I gave them the house," it sounds like bragging until you see what I mean by gave. How I slid the folder across the lawyer's desk with the briskness of a nurse snapping on gloves. How I wrote the check with a pen that still smelled faintly of new bank and signed my name with the same pressure I used to press feverish foreheads. How I did not ask for my name to be stamped anywhere people could see, because I believed in the quiet architecture of families, the way rooms hold you, because someone once decided you should be held. And so I kept my pride like a clean dish towel, present, useful, invisible until needed, ill. The first month after the wedding, when they were still finding where the pans belonged and which window latch stuck in humid weather, my key was a kindness. I used it to slip in with groceries when their meetings ran late, to leave flowers on the kitchen table on the day my son's big client finally signed, to water the ficus that drooped by the sliding doors because it hadn't learned the light of its new life yet. And each time I relocked the door behind me, texted that I'd come and gone, and signed off with a small blossom emoji that Caroline once said was cute in an old internet way, which I took as a compliment until I learned the weight of her smile. My key did not turn into a problem all at once. It began with a suggestion to call before I came, which I did, faithfully, and then a reminder to call earlier, and then a calendar link for good drop-by windows. And just like that, my love acquired office hours and a dress code. And I adjusted, because adjustment is what has kept so many of us alive. And also, because I didn't want to turn kindness into an argument or confuse access with entitlement. And because the baby was coming, and new parents are a little like houses after a storm. Everything needed, everything delicate, everything a breath away from collapse. On the morning the sentence landed, I had carried over a small tin of shortbread for the freezer and a quilt I'd finished binding late the night before. Red squares like small, steady pulses against a field of cream. A practical beauty you could spread over the back of a couch without announcing it to visitors. I let myself in like I always did. One click, one step, the small habit of wiping my shoes on the mat even if the weather was dry. And the house smelled lightly of coffee and citrus peel, and that baby sweetness that sneaks into cloth and refuses to leave. And for a moment, the rooms did that generous thing they do when you are still loved in them. They let you believe you belong. Caroline appeared, tidy and slender, and already perfectly dressed for a day she hadn't lived yet. And she said hello with her mouth and discomfort with her shoulders. And I saw it. Because at 80, you see what people hope you've stopped noticing. And I imagined a better conversation than the one we had. One where she said, "I didn't sleep last night, and I can smell my own fear. And I'd feel safer if I knew exactly when the door would open, even if it's you." And I would have said, "Of course, darling, of course." And we would have made a plan that honored both the baby and the woman who had once cut her wedding cake with my son. But my imagined conversation stayed perfect in my head while the real one bumped along the baseboards, and somewhere in there my son arrived, breathless and late and certain he was saving the day. I looked at him the way mothers look, not at the hairline or the shirt or the shoe, but at the boy he had been under the man he performed. The third-grade champion of multiplication tables who cried when the school gerbil died and asked if grief had a bedtime. The teenager who slammed doors and then came back to open them because he was afraid of splinters. The young man who kissed my cheek before walking down the courthouse steps with a ring in his pocket and a tremor in his elbow. I looked at him and thought, say it cleanly if you must, but don't say it like a pamphlet. And he did not hear the prayer I kept behind my teeth. And so we stood in a room I bought and pretended the question was whether a key is polite. I live now with small economies that don't show up in photographs. I cut the sponge in half so it lasts longer. I freeze half the loaf. I pour the last inch of milk into a jar that fits its ambition. And on Fridays, I buy 2 apricots if they look like the ones my mother bought when the world was still black and white in our kitchen, and we ate standing up, because joy doesn't always make it to a plate. I tell you this because what people think of as independence at my age is often a careful choreography with money and time and convenience stores. And because it matters that the house was a gift I could only afford, because I already lived smaller than a woman with a son in finance is supposed to, and because it matters that nobody wants to hear that part over rosemary chicken while the baby monitor glows like a second moon. The week Caroline returned from the hospital, I let myself in to leave a pot of chicken broth on low and a basket of folded onesies that smelled like lemon and patience. And I sat for 7 minutes, no more, on the edge of the couch in the quiet between cries, watching the new shape of their days breathe in and out. And when I rose to leave, I placed my key on the counter for a moment and remembered the shape of every lock it had ever learned. The deadbolt on our first rental after my husband died. The stubborn latch on the cottage that never kept out the wind but held laughter. Just fine. The easy turn on the door to my parents' flat, where the neighbor could open with a hairpin. A city of doors my hand has read like Braille. Do not imagine I marched around their house like an inspector. I moved the way a good nurse moves, present, purposeful, vanishing before the patient has a chance to apologize. Yet the day came when presence itself was an intrusion, and love needed a schedule, and the metal proof of my care was recast as a boundary violation, and so my son stood with his hands on his hips the way his father used to when he wanted to look authoritative, and he said, the sentence that will not unsay itself, and because I am old enough to know that arguing with a feeling is like shouting at fog, I did the only graceful thing left. I slid my key back into my pocket and let the room feel its victory. Afterward, I walked home slowly the long way around the park, where the benches lean a little as if listening, and I thought about the first night I slept on the floor of that house before the furniture arrived, how my back ached and my heart didn't, how I lay awake counting new house sounds and promising my husband, dead 2 decades but still skeptical, that I knew what I was doing, that I wouldn't spoil the boy, that a house could teach steadiness, that it could keep a marriage warm if the people inside remembered the difference between privacy and secrecy. And I wanted to report to him that I had been partly right, that the walls do their best, that wood is a patient listener, that marble reflects whatever stands over it, whether it's a birthday cake or a frown. The tailor downstairs had propped his shop door open, and the steam rose like a blessing, and I thought about how many garments I have hemmed for other people's comfort, how many times I let the needle find the place the fabric wanted to fold. And I asked myself when, exactly, I started believing that my body was the extra fabric in someone else's outfit. I unlocked my door. The good lock I paid for because softness deserves safety, and I stood in the square of late light that lives on my kitchen floor in the hour after 5, and I did not cry, because tears felt too clean for what this was. Instead, I boiled water and peeled a potato in one long ribbon and ate standing up like a girl just home from school who trusted the day to move over and make space for her. You want to know who I am? I am the woman who kept the warranty cards on the washer and the waffle iron, who labeled the Christmas lights by length so nobody would start a marriage by swearing at a knot, who knows the smell of a baby's neck means somebody will try to keep you from it by calling it a boundary, who writes grocery lists on the back of envelopes because habit tastes like home, who has learned which neighbors can be asked for a ladder and which cannot be asked for a minute, who can tell you when a plant needs to be moved 2 feet to the left without making you feel stupid, who hears the difference between a door politely closed and a door gently shut on you. I am 80, yes, but 80 is not a cliff. It is a ledge with a view, and I am standing on it looking down at a house I bought and a sentence that tried to erase what I offered, and I am telling you at the very beginning, so you'll understand the rest. The pain leads, the setting will catch up, and I will not ask you to pity me, because pity is just another way to keep a woman quiet. I will, however, ask you to listen the way a good house listens, with your weight in the right place and your drafts admitted honestly, because somewhere between the key that no longer turns and the hand that remembers where to fit it, I began to understand the difference between being welcomed and being tolerated. And once you learn that, you do not unlearn it, no matter how sweet the baby, no matter how persuasive the sun, no matter how beautifully the counters throw back the afternoon light. It happened on a Monday afternoon so ordinary that I almost missed the sound of something breaking. I had walked to their house, a routine I'd kept even after the first argument about boundaries, because old habits do not surrender politely. The sun was mild, the kind of early autumn light that flatters every surface and hides nothing, and I carried a pot of lentil stew wrapped in a towel so it would stay warm. I remember thinking that the hydrangeas along their path looked tired, their color fading into that bruised blue that signals both beauty and exhaustion, and I promised myself I'd bring pruning shears next week. It was an easy walk. I could do it even on days when my knees staged small rebellions. When I reached the porch, I balanced the pot against my hip, slipped my key into the lock, and felt the immediate resistance. An unfamiliar catch, a blunt refusal that didn't belong to the metal, but to the intention behind it. I tried again, slower this time, turning it as if patience could persuade hardware. The key stopped halfway, and something in me stopped with it. There was a note taped to the door, written in Caroline's smooth, perfect handwriting. "Please call before coming by. We're trying to keep things on a schedule with the baby. Hope you understand." It was the "hope you understand" that did it, the polite varnish over a quiet exile. I stood there longer than necessary, the pot cooling in my arms, the key still resting between my fingers like a witness. A breeze lifted the corner of the note and tapped it gently against the door. A small applause for the performance of civility. A neighbor across the street waved, mistaking my stillness for thoughtfulness, and I waved back because I've been trained to perform composure even when my insides are rearranging themselves into something brittle. For a moment I considered knocking. After all, my name was still on the original deed. The house was not just a gift, but a legal extension of me, and the practical part of my brain wanted to remind them of that fact. But the older, quieter part of me knew that knocking would only confirm my displacement. Knocking means you're outside. Knocking means you agree that entry requires permission. I stood there on that porch and thought of the first time I held my son, how his tiny fingers closed around my own as if they'd found the key to the world, and how now, 50 years later, I was standing before a door that denied the echo of that gesture. I placed the pot carefully on the welcome mat. The irony of the word didn't escape me, and stepped back. For the first time, I saw how much the house resembled them now. Symmetrical, curated, guarded. Even the blinds were drawn at an identical angle, the slats like eyelids lowered against surprise. I took a photograph of the note with my phone, not to keep as evidence, but because disbelief sometimes needs a prop. Then I turned and walked home, slower than usual, the world suddenly heavier at the edges. When I reached my apartment, I put the key on the kitchen counter and stared at it, its dull brass glinting in the light from the window. I imagined all the doors it had opened, the first night I brought over their groceries after they moved in, the mornings I'd slip in quietly to feed the cat while they traveled, the afternoons I'd water the plants so the leaves wouldn't brown before they returned. Every act of care had been a silent conversation between that key and the lock, a mutual agreement of trust. Now that conversation was over, replaced by a sign that said, "Please call." My son phoned that evening. His voice was soft, hesitant, the tone people use when they're about to betray you but hope you'll make it easy for them. "Mom," he began, "I wanted to call before you found out, but Caroline thought it would be better coming from me. We had the locks changed." I said. "I noticed." He exhaled with relief, as if I'd spared him from the burden of confrontation. "It's nothing personal," he said, the same phrase he used when he didn't want to discuss layoffs or missed holidays. "Caroline's just been feeling anxious since the baby came. It's a security thing. We've got cameras now, a new system. It's standard. We should have done it earlier." His justifications came in smooth, rounded phrases, polished by repetition. I listened to them roll over me like pebbles in shallow water. "You can always call before you come by," he added, as if he were offering a compromise, a token of modern reason. "Do you feel unsafe when I'm there?" I asked. It was a genuine question. I wanted to understand the nature of my new threat. There was a pause long enough to make me wish I hadn't asked. "It's not about feeling unsafe," he said finally. "It's about boundaries." That word again, the new gospel of comfort. "Caroline just needs a little space right now. You know how intense new motherhood can be." I wanted to say that I did, that I had carried him through fevers and tantrums and unpaid bills, that I had held my breath for years while he learned to become the kind of man who could afford to speak about space. But he was already thanking me for understanding, his voice brightening with the relief of a man who believes he's handled a difficult conversation well. After the call, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The street outside buzzed with the ordinary life of other people, delivery trucks groaning at the curb, children arguing about a ball, a dog barking at nothing. But inside, time went thin and strange. I took the key in my hand and felt the slight indentation near the bow, the mark left by decades of turning. It had once been smooth, new, a promise that I was part of something ongoing. Now it was a relic, a small artifact of a trust that had expired without notice. I could have thrown it away then, dropped it into the bin, and let the garbage collectors carry off the evidence of my displacement. But instead, I placed it in the drawer next to my spare batteries and sewing kit, the things that keep a home functioning quietly in the background. For several days, I didn't go near the neighborhood. I told myself I was giving them time to adjust, but really, I was giving myself time to stop flinching every time I thought about the word boundaries. When I finally returned, it was under the pretense of walking to the library. I passed the house slowly, pretending not to look, but of course I did. There was a new security camera above the garage, small and black and mercilessly alert. I wondered if it could recognize me, if somewhere Caroline's phone would buzz with an alert. Motion detected. Elderly female at front gate. The thought was absurd, but it clung to me anyway. The hydrangeas had been pruned after all, their tired branches cut away, the flower beds cleaned to perfection. My fingerprints were gone from the doorknobs, my footprints from the porch, my smell from the hallway. A house forgets you faster than people do, and people are not far behind. That evening, I baked another batch of shortbread, purely out of muscle memory. I wrapped it in parchment, tied it with a ribbon, and placed it on my own kitchen counter. I thought of the thousands of gestures that had built my motherhood, the meals, the rides, the endless small repairs, and realized how easily they could be rewritten as intrusions. All it takes is a single sentence spoken by a son who can no longer distinguish between love and interference. The betrayal wasn't loud. It didn't shatter anything you could sweep up. It was quiet, domestic, paper thin, the sound of a new lock turning where an old key fails, the sound of civility closing a door it swears is still open. 2 days later, a parcel arrived at my apartment. Inside was a small digital photo frame, the kind that cycles through images automatically. It was from Caroline, accompanied by a note written in the same smooth hand. Thought you'd like to have these to keep in touch. Love, Caroline. The photos were of the baby, mostly, all soft light and curated joy, and one of my son holding the child against his shoulder, his eyes half closed in tenderness. None of me. Not a single one. It was a gift meant to soothe, but it only confirmed what I already knew. I had been replaced by my own representation. I was meant to watch their life like a spectator, not participate in it. I unplugged the frame after the third loop and set it in the closet. The silence that followed was oddly peaceful. That night, as I lay in bed, the sounds of the city drifted through the open window. The hum of a distant train, the rustle of leaves, someone laughing on the street below. And I thought about the word uncomfortable. What did it mean for a woman like me to make someone uncomfortable? Was it my presence, my age, my memory of who my son used to be? Or was it the simple fact that love, when it lasts too long, begins to embarrass the people who benefited from it? I closed my eyes and saw again the pot of stew cooling on the porch, the condensation on the lid forming perfect circles, the note fluttering in the wind like a polite little flag of surrender. I realized then that something had shifted permanently, not just between me and them, but within me. A door had closed, yes, but in doing so, it had opened another somewhere quieter, somewhere I hadn't yet seen. The next morning, I woke early, made a cup of strong coffee, and opened my notebook to a blank page. At the top, I wrote a single line. What remains when the lock changes? It wasn't a question for them. It was for me. For a while, I tried to believe it was only a misunderstanding, a temporary season of nerves and sleepless nights, the kind that passes when babies start sleeping through and husbands remember to look up from their phones. I told myself that one day I would come by with a pie, and the old key would slide in again as if nothing had changed, that the word boundaries would fade the way trends do when the next one arrives. But houses, like people, do not forget the language of exclusion once it's spoken. Each week after that Monday seemed to erase another small piece of me from their world, not with cruelty, but with the quiet efficiency of spring cleaning. It began with my photo on the hallway shelf, an old picture from Daniel's college graduation, me standing between him and his father, sunlight on my shoulder like proof of lineage. When I visited next, the photo was gone, replaced by a potted succulent and a minimalist clock that didn't even tick loud enough to remind anyone of time passing. I told myself they had simply redecorated, but when I looked around, there were no traces of me anywhere. Not in the kitchen drawer where I'd once kept extra tea bags, not in the linen closet where I used to store the spare quilt. Every inch of that house had been wiped of evidence that I had ever been welcome. Still, I kept finding reasons to stop by. I told Daniel I'd found a new herbal remedy for Caroline's migraines, or that I had coupons for the baby's formula, or that I was walking in the neighborhood anyway. I could hear the restraint in his voice each time. That's thoughtful, Mom, but we're good. The we was heavy. It excluded me like a gate with my name engraved on the wrong side. Caroline always managed to look grateful and uncomfortable at once, her lips curving into a smile that never reached her eyes. I began to study those eyes the way you study a stranger's window when you've lost your own reflection. I noticed how they flicked toward the baby monitor even when the baby wasn't crying. How her shoulders tensed if I leaned too close to the counter. How she would thank me for the smallest things with the tone of someone returning borrowed money they wish they'd never accepted. On Sundays, when they invited me for dinner, every other week now instead of every week, I'd bring dessert. The first few times I baked, but soon Caroline started saying, "Oh, don't trouble yourself, we've gone sugar-free," or "The kids prefer store-bought." So I switched to fruit, but even that became wrong somehow. Too ripe, too soft, too much. One night, I arrived with a basket of peaches from the market, proud of their fragrance, and found Caroline arranging plastic fruit in a bowl on the table, smooth and spotless, eternal. "They last longer," she said, and smiled as if permanence were proof of taste. We ate salmon without salt and laughed about nothing. I watched my son talk about interest rates, the baby's sleep schedule, his gym routine, all while avoiding my gaze. The kind of small talk that sounds like life, but feels like silence. When I left that night, Caroline followed me to the door and said, "You don't have to bring anything next time, just yourself." It sounded kind, but the word just held its own kind of dismissal. It meant, "Bring less of you." I nodded, kissed her cheek, and stepped into the cool night. The air outside was thick with the smell of cut grass and something faintly metallic, like rain thinking about falling. I walked home under the streetlights and thought of the phrase, "just yourself." It echoed like a small commandment. I wondered which version of myself she meant. The mother who once lent them the down payment. The woman who kept every birthday card Daniel ever drew in crayon. The nurse who sat through 12-hour night shifts so he could go to college without loans. Or the quieter self who stood in the foyer holding a pot of stew that no one asked for. Weeks passed. The invitations thinned. When they did come, they were phrased like obligations. "We're doing a little brunch next Sunday if you're free," Daniel would say, already certain I wasn't. I began to fill my time with errands that didn't need doing, organizing my recipe box, ironing dish towels, labeling spice jars. I told myself that solitude was rest, but it wasn't. It was the sound of a life shrinking politely. Even the cat from the tailor's shop downstairs began to recognize my schedule. He'd wait outside my door at 7 each evening for the small saucer of milk I pretended was for him, though really it was for me, to prove I could still feed someone. Then came the baby's christening. A formal event, the kind of ceremony that used to belong to women like me, the keepers of traditions, the ones who brought meaning along with the lace. Carolyn sent an invitation by email, a formality more than an inclusion. The message said, "Small gathering afterward at the house. Dress code, pastel or neutral." I wore a pale blue dress and the pearl necklace Daniel had given me on my 60th birthday, though when I arrived, I noticed Caroline's mother wearing almost the same shade of blue. Caroline looked me up and down, smiled too tightly, and whispered, "Oh, how sweet. We match." During the ceremony, I sat 2 pews behind the family section, watching them from a respectful distance that no one had requested, but everyone expected. Afterward, at the house, I found my name missing from the seating cards at the long dining table. Caroline gestured toward a smaller table near the patio. "We thought you might prefer somewhere quieter," she said. The table was beautiful, covered in linen and flowers, but empty except for me and the pastor's wife. From that corner, I watched Daniel toast his wife's devotion, the baby's serenity, the blessing of a family built on love and boundaries. He said that word again. Boundaries and laughter rippled around the table like a well-rehearsed choir. I raised my glass too, though my throat had gone dry. Love and boundaries. The pairing was so neat it made me dizzy. I thought of my own mother, who never spoke of boundaries because her love didn't require architecture. We lived in a house where the door was always open, not out of carelessness, but conviction. She used to say, "If you love someone, you make space for them to surprise you." I looked at my son and his careful family and realized there was no space left for surprise, only maintenance. After the christening, the messages stopped almost entirely. I called once, to ask if they needed anything from the market, and Daniel said, "We're good, Mom. Caroline's been doing meal prep." Another time, I offered to babysit so they could have an evening out, but Caroline's voice through the phone was brisk. "That's kind, but we've got someone the baby's used to." Someone the baby's used to. As if familiarity were a commodity she'd cornered the market on. I began to notice the language of substitution everywhere. They called their cleaning service part of the family, their nanny our lifesaver, their financial advisor, practically an uncle. I had become an echo, an outdated version of help. When I did see them, rarely, briefly, it was always with others present. Group lunches, neighborhood events, places where politeness could camouflage distance. The last time I visited the house, Caroline introduced me to a neighbor as Daniel's mom. She's visiting from across town. Across town, as though I lived in another province, another decade. I smiled and shook the neighbor's hand, feeling the phrase sink under my skin. Later, when I excused myself to use the restroom, I passed by the nursery. The door was slightly ajar, and for a moment I hesitated, listening to the soft hum of a white noise machine. I stepped inside quietly, just for a second. The crib was draped with a mobile of tiny paper birds spinning lazily in the light. On the dresser stood a framed photograph. Caroline, Daniel, and the baby, all in matching cream-colored outfits. It was a professional portrait, perfect in balance and lighting, and it replaced the snapshot I'd taken months before, the one I'd framed and gifted them myself, where Daniel's eyes were closed and Caroline's hair was windblown, and the baby looked like a miracle still learning to breathe. My version had been replaced by a cleaner one, an improved family with no trace of the woman who took the picture. I didn't cry in that room. I simply reached out and steadied one of the paper birds, watched it tremble, then walked away. On my way out, I passed the security panel by the door and saw my name listed under Guest Access, inactive. It took me a moment to understand. The system had once sent me codes when they traveled, a small trust that said, "You are part of this home." Now it said I was expired. That night, I went home and opened a drawer I hadn't touched in months. Inside was the original folder from the house purchase, the papers I'd signed 10 years earlier when Daniel couldn't qualify for the mortgage alone. My name, printed neatly above his, looked foreign now, like something that had survived a translation too many times. I traced the letters with my finger, not in anger but in disbelief at my own naivete. I had thought giving meant belonging. I had thought generosity was insurance against forgetting. But love given freely is easy to lose. People mistake it for air. I started writing lists in the evenings, small inventories of what I still owned, what I had lost, what I might reclaim. I listed the books I wanted to reread, the friends I'd stopped calling because I was too busy being available for a family that no longer required me. I listed the things I'd do differently if I could start again. Keep one of the houses I'd helped renovate. Keep my name on the papers. Keep a record of every promise before it turned into etiquette. Yet beneath those lists, something quieter began to form. Something that didn't look like bitterness, but recognition. The first escalation wasn't loud. It was the growing awareness that I had been edited out gently, efficiently, without malice, the way a photo is cropped to fit a frame. And like any good edit, it left no visible seam. By the time winter came, I had stopped expecting the phone to ring. I filled my days with small routines, baking bread, feeding the tailor's cat, joining a senior yoga class where nobody cared if I used the wrong mat. People there called me Mare, and for a while it felt almost like a new identity, one that didn't depend on someone else's permission. But at night, when I passed the key drawer on my way to bed, I still felt the weight of the old brass in its quiet resting place. I never touched it. I just listened to the silence it guarded, the slow, patient hum of a life that had learned to exist outside its own door. It was near the end of winter when the silence in my apartment began to change temperature. It no longer felt cold or punitive, but simply still, as though the air itself had accepted that no one would burst through the door with a casserole dish or a question about the baby's teething. I woke one morning to find sunlight crawling over the radiator, thick and golden, and I realized I had not spoken aloud in 2 days. The discovery was not sad, just strange, like finding an old photograph of yourself smiling in a way you no longer recognize. I made tea, sat at the small table by the window, and decided that if I was going to live in this quiet, I might as well learn its grammar. The first rule of silence is that it asks nothing of you except attention. The second is that once you stop fearing it, it begins to tell you the truth. And the truth was that I had built my life around being needed, so when no one needed me, I mistook that for death. But it wasn't. It was simply the space left over when usefulness steps aside. That morning, I walked farther than I had in months, past the florist where I used to buy peonies for Caroline, past the church where I'd lit candles for Daniel during his exams, past the bakery that had closed years ago, but still smelled faintly of cinnamon in the cracks of the doorway. The city was bright and indifferent, and that indifference felt, for the first time, merciful. I stopped at the community center on 3rd Street because a sign in the window caught my eye. Writing for Memory. New class begins. March 5th. The words looked almost embarrassed to exist among posters for yoga, tax help, and blood drives. Writing for Memory. I stood there for a long moment, my hand on the cool glass, and thought of the notebooks I used to keep when I was nursing. Tiny records of shifts, patient notes, recipes scrawled in the margins. I had always been writing, only never for myself. That night, I signed up for the class online, though I nearly talked myself out of it twice before pressing Submit. The room smelled of coffee and old paper when I arrived the following week. There were 8 of us, mostly women, mostly carrying something we didn't know how to name. The instructor, a retired librarian named June, wore a silver scarf and the expression of someone who believed words could save your life if you let them. She began by saying, "You don't need to have something remarkable to say. You just need to tell the truth about what you remember." The sentence struck me harder than I expected. I had spent years smoothing the truth for others, polishing it until it reflected back what they wanted to see. Now I was being asked to tell it plainly. June handed out notebooks with soft covers and said we could write about anything: a sound, a meal, a betrayal. I wrote about apricots because that was the first thing that came to mind. The smell of them in my mother's kitchen in August, the way she'd slice them into a chipped white bowl and sprinkle sugar on top until they glistened like forgiveness. By the time I looked up, the class was over. June asked if I'd like to read my piece next week. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I could bear hearing my own voice again. That night, I went home lighter. The walk back felt different, the street lamps softer, as if the city were dimming itself to listen. I brewed tea and reread what I'd written, tracing each line with my finger, and I realized it wasn't about apricots at all. It was about staying sweet in a world that had turned to stone. Something in me shifted then. Not a grand epiphany, just a small internal realignment. The kind of change that sneaks in quietly, but rearranges the furniture of your soul. I thought of the key in the drawer, the locked house, the polite notes, and I felt neither anger nor grief, just distance, as if those events belonged to another woman whose story I happened to know well. In the weeks that followed, I wrote constantly. I wrote about the smell of rain on hospital sheets, about the sound of my husband's laughter when he burned toast, about the way Daniel used to slip his hand into mine when crossing the street, even after he was tall enough to look me in the eye. Some pieces were barely paragraphs, others sprawled across pages. June said I had a voice of steadiness, which sounded like a compliment, but also a diagnosis. I realized I had been steady all my life, steady through loss, through labor, through the slow erosion of relevance. But steadiness without witness becomes invisibility. Writing gave me back my outline. Around that time, I sold my car. It had been sitting in the garage for months, its tires sighing into the concrete. When the buyer, a young woman with paint on her jeans, handed me the envelope of cash, I felt a small pang. Not for the car, but for the years it represented. Errands, school runs, weekend drives with my husband singing off-key. I took the money straight to the community center and asked if they had any programs that needed funding. June overheard and suggested a new supply shelf for the writing class, for the next people who need a place to remember. I agreed. It felt right that something once meant to move me forward would now help others find their own way back. My days began to fill again, not with obligation, but with intention. I woke early, walked to the park, fed the pigeons, wrote for an hour, and sometimes lingered at a cafe where no one knew me. The barista, a tall man with kind eyes, started greeting me as Miss Regular. It was a small, ridiculous thing, but it made me laugh. And laughter has a way of stitching small tears you didn't know were there. In the afternoons, I volunteered at the senior library desk, helping people find large print novels or remember the names of forgotten authors. There was one woman, nearly blind, who liked to sit beside me and describe the stories she half remembered from her youth. I'd look them up for her, and she'd sigh as though recovering lost relatives. These exchanges became my new rhythm, small proofs that I could still contribute without being consumed. One evening in class, June asked us to write a letter we'd never send. I knew immediately whom mine would be to. I began, "Dear Daniel, this is not about forgiveness because forgiveness implies debt, and I no longer owe you anything. It's about truth, and truth is simpler than love." The words surprised me. They weren't cruel, only clear. I wrote for pages, describing how it felt to stand on that porch with a key that no longer fit. How it felt to hear my son's voice bend itself into politeness to justify exclusion. When I finished, my hands trembled slightly. June, who had a way of sensing when someone had reached the edge of their old life, came over and said quietly, "That's a beginning, not an ending." I nodded because I understood. Writing doesn't close wounds. It gives them shape so they can breathe. After class, I walked out into the cool spring night and bought a small notebook from the convenience store. It wasn't fancy, lined paper, flimsy cover, but I carried it everywhere. I wrote grocery lists and memories side by side. Eggs, bread, the day Daniel learned to tie his shoes, the day I taught him to say please and thank you, and believed those words would protect him from cruelty. Sometimes, at the cafe, I'd notice people my son's age with their parents, laughing over coffee, and instead of jealousy, I felt curiosity. I wondered if those mothers were also performing cheerfulness, if they too had learned that motherhood, at its quietest, is a long act of disappearing gracefully. One afternoon, while helping at the library, a little girl tugged my sleeve and asked if I could read to her. Her grandmother had gone to the restroom, and she didn't want to sit alone. I read The Velveteen Rabbit, my voice catching on certain lines I hadn't heard in decades. "When you are real," the skin horse said, "you don't mind being hurt." The girl leaned against my arm as I spoke, her warmth steady and unguarded. When her grandmother returned, she thanked me, and I realized I was still capable of offering comfort that required no permission, no scheduling app, no boundary negotiations. That evening, I wrote in my notebook, "Perhaps love after 60 is just the practice of staying open when no one asks you to." It was around this time that I stopped checking my phone for messages from Daniel. I didn't block him. I simply stopped waiting. The device became what it was meant to be, a tool, not a pulse monitor for affection. In its absence, I found other rhythms. The whistle of the kettle, the creak of the chair, the shuffle of the tailor downstairs closing up for the night. Small, faithful sounds that asked nothing but recognition. I began to think of my life as a room slowly filling with light, not the blinding kind that exposes dust, but the warm kind that forgives it. One evening, while sorting through old papers, I found a photograph tucked inside a cookbook. It was from Daniel's wedding day. He and Caroline stood on the porch of the very house that now refused me, the sun catching the curve of their smiles. Behind them, slightly out of focus, was me, holding a bouquet of hydrangeas and looking somewhere off to the side, as though I already knew what was coming. I studied that woman in the background for a long time. She looked dignified, cautious, hopeful. I whispered to her, "You did your best." Then I placed the photo in my writing notebook instead of putting it back in the book where it had been hiding. It was no longer evidence of loss, but of witness. By the start of summer, something inside me had steadied. The bitterness had thinned into something quieter, something that felt almost like clarity. I was no longer waiting for an apology or an invitation. I was learning to live as a person, not as a role. Sometimes in class, June would ask us to describe where we belonged, and I would write, "Here, at this table, among women who remember." The key in the drawer remained where it was, but it no longer called to me. It was simply metal, an artifact of another era. The new lock on their door had closed one life. But these pages, these walks, this quiet recognition of self, was the door that had opened in its place. It was late summer when the first tremor of confrontation found me again, quiet but undeniable, arriving in the form of an invitation that felt more like a test than a gesture of love. Daniel called on a Wednesday evening, his voice as smooth and distant as the surface of a lake that hides its coldness beneath the calm. "Mom," he said, "we're having a little get-together for Ethan's birthday next week. Just family, nothing fancy. Caroline wanted me to make sure you knew you're, of course, welcome." "Of course," he said, as though welcome were a foregone conclusion and not a fragile negotiated term between us. It had been almost a year since I had stepped foot inside their house. The baby, no longer quite a baby, was turning 2. I imagined him walking, laughing, forming his first words, sounds I had not been permitted to hear in person, only through filtered videos Caroline occasionally sent, always accompanied by cheerful captions that made absence look like choice. I told Daniel I'd come, because even after all that had happened, I couldn't quite train my heart to refuse the possibility of grace, no matter how slim. He seemed relieved, as if he had just solved a delicate logistical problem, not extended a fragile bridge to his mother. The week before the party, I found myself rehearsing, absurdly, as though I were preparing for an audition rather than a family gathering. I practiced how to greet Caroline without appearing eager, how to hold the child without overstepping, how to praise the house without sounding wistful. I even debated whether to bring a gift, then decided against it. Every object now carried the risk of being interpreted as a statement. Instead, I wrote a small note on heavy cream paper that said simply, "Happy birthday, my love. May the world always open its doors for you." I placed the card in an envelope and sealed it with the faintest touch of perfume, the same scent I wore when Daniel was young and would hug me tightly before school, inhaling as if to carry me with him for the day. The morning of the party dawned clear and mercilessly bright. I chose a soft linen dress, pale gray with tiny embroidered leaves, understated and safe. On my way out, I hesitated by the drawer where the old key still rested. For a moment, I let my fingers brush its cool surface, then closed the drawer gently. I took the bus instead of a cab, not out of thrift, but out of ritual. The slow movement through familiar streets steadied my breath. When I arrived, the driveway was already lined with cars, the air vibrating with laughter and the smell of grilled food. From a distance, the house looked like a photograph of happiness, curated, symmetrical, self-assured. I stood at the gate for a moment, smoothing the folds of my dress, and then pressed the bell. Caroline opened the door, her smile broad and practiced, the kind reserved for neighbors or potential donors. "Oh, you made it," she said brightly, as though my arrival were a pleasant surprise rather than an expectation. Behind her, voices swirled. Daniel's laughter, the high pitch of children, the rhythmic hum of conversation. The house was full, fuller than I remembered, filled with the kind of people who speak loudly to hide their insecurities. I stepped inside, the air cool from the conditioning, scented faintly of vanilla candles. Every corner gleamed. The walls had been repainted a warm ivory, the photographs updated. Caroline holding Ethan at the beach. Daniel trimming the garden hedge, the three of them in matching sweaters by a Christmas tree. I recognized the house, but not the life within it. Daniel appeared, flushed and cheerful, a drink in his hand. "Mom!" he exclaimed, as if he hadn't expected me to accept the invitation. He hugged me briefly, carefully, the kind of hug that ends before warmth can begin. "You look great," he said, stepping back, and gestured vaguely toward the crowd. "Come, everyone's in the backyard." His words felt rehearsed, like lines learned for a role he didn't believe in. I followed him through the house, catching fragments of conversation. Real estate, preschool applications, summer homes, and for a moment I wondered when the language of family had become a dialect I no longer spoke. Outside, the garden looked like something from a magazine. Strings of lights, a table heavy with food, a small inflatable pool where the children splashed under the watchful eyes of adults who never seemed to tire of explaining sunscreen. Caroline's parents were there, elegant and self-satisfied, and when they saw me, they greeted me with that peculiar politeness reserved for people who have been discussed privately. I smiled and accepted a glass of lemonade I didn't want. Ethan was on the lawn, wobbling uncertainly as he tried to chase a balloon. I felt the pull in my chest, instinctive and raw. The old magnetic ache of motherhood extended into grandmotherhood. When he looked up and saw me, his face lit with something pure, something unmediated by his parents' boundaries. "Nana!" he cried, the word sharp and clear as sunlight through glass. For a moment, the whole scene seemed to pause. Then Caroline laughed lightly, too lightly, and said, "Oh, he remembers you." The guests smiled. Daniel looked away. I knelt and opened my arms, and Ethan ran toward me, unsteady but determined. He smelled of milk and grass and the faint sweetness of soap. I held him close, my heart catching the rhythm of his small body, and for that brief minute the world made sense again. It didn't last. Caroline's voice sliced through the moment, pleasant but firm. "Let's not get him too excited before cake time, okay?" I nodded and set him down gently, and she swooped in to guide him toward the other children. Her hand brushed my shoulder in what could have been affection or control. It was impossible to tell. The party unfolded around me in a blur of small talk and laughter that didn't quite include me. I helped set plates on the table, though no one had asked me to. When I tried to refill the lemonade pitcher, Caroline appeared beside me. "Oh, you don't have to do that," she said, her tone light but her eyes sharp. "We've got it handled." She turned to one of her friends and added, with a smile that had edges, "She's always so eager to help. It's sweet." They laughed, not unkindly, but the sound pressed against my ribs like a bruise. After the cake and the photographs, posed, endless, exhausting, I found a quiet corner near the back fence. The evening light was softening, turning everything gold. Daniel joined me, his tie loosened, his face tired in a way that made him look like the boy he used to be. "You okay?" he asked, and I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. "Of course," I said. "Why wouldn't I be?" He hesitated, then said, "Caroline's just trying to manage everything, you know. She gets anxious when things feel out of control." I wanted to ask whether my presence counted as chaos, whether a mother's breath could unsettle a household so easily, but I bit the words back. Instead, I said, "I understand." And I did. Understanding is not the same as agreeing. It is the quiet acceptance that some people will trade warmth for control and call it maturity. Later, as guests began to leave, Caroline approached me with a polite smile. "I hope you had a nice time," she said. "It's so good for Ethan to see everyone." "Everyone," she said, as though my presence were a statistical requirement. Then she added, almost as an afterthought, "I know it's hard when routines change, but we're really trying to create a calm space for him. You know, predictable." The implication hung in the air like a scent that wouldn't fade. I was the unpredictable element. I looked at her for a long moment, not with anger, but with the weary clarity of someone who has finally stopped expecting honesty from performance. "I hope it works," I said quietly, and turned away. The next morning, Daniel called. His voice was tight, careful. "Mom, can we talk about yesterday?" I said yes, though I already knew what was coming. "Caroline felt a bit uncomfortable when you held Ethan for so long," he began. "She just worries he'll get overstimulated." I listened, the words rolling past me like water over stone. "She also mentioned she felt like maybe you were watching her a little critically. I know you didn't mean anything by it, but she's sensitive right now." I almost smiled at that. The idea that sensitivity now justified every exclusion, that my mere gaze could be reinterpreted as judgment. "Daniel," I said, You don't have to protect her from me." He sighed, the way people sigh when they think they're being reasonable. "It's not about protection, Mom. It's about boundaries." There it was again, the word that had built a wall through the center of our family. "Maybe next time we can plan a shorter visit. Just something calm, maybe at a park." Next time. The phrase felt both hopeful and hollow. "Of course," I said. He thanked me for understanding, as always. That evening I went for a long walk along the river. The air was heavy with the smell of water and cut grass. The sun slipped behind the bridge, turning the surface of the river to molten copper. I thought about how many versions of understanding I had performed in my life. How often women are praised for their capacity to absorb pain quietly, to repackage hurt as patience. I thought about the key still resting in my drawer and the door it once fit, and I realized it wasn't just a house I had lost. It was a language. Once, the word home had meant proximity to love. Now, it meant a perimeter drawn around someone else's comfort. Over the next weeks, small signs of estrangement began to multiply like cracks in old plaster. Caroline stopped sending photos altogether. Daniel's calls grew shorter, filled with updates about work and the weather, never about feeling. One day, I received a message from Caroline's email account, a mass invitation to a charity fundraiser at their house, addressed to friends and family. I wasn't sure which category I belonged to anymore. Out of curiosity more than longing, I looked at the event's website. There was a photo of the house, its porch lined with new flowers, its front steps repainted. The caption read, "Our family home, a place of warmth and welcome." The words were almost funny in their falseness. I thought of the day I'd painted those same steps before their wedding, my hands stained with color and hope, and how even paint, once dry, forgets who held the brush. The next time I saw them was by chance. I was leaving the market when I spotted Daniel and Caroline on the opposite sidewalk, Ethan in a stroller between them. I waved before I could stop myself. Daniel looked up, startled, then smiled, half-heartedly. Caroline hesitated, then crossed the street, her face composed into that flawless expression of social grace. "Oh, hi. What a surprise," she said. Her eyes flicked to the bags in my hands, as though inspecting the contents for judgment. "We were just heading to the park." Ethan reached for me, tiny hands outstretched, but Caroline gently redirected him, murmuring, "Not now, sweetheart." The gesture was subtle but final. I crouched anyway, smiled at him, said, "You're getting so big." He laughed, that bright, unguarded laugh children have before they learn to measure it. "We should catch up sometime," Caroline said to me, her voice already fading into future tense. I nodded, though we both knew the promise was ceremonial. They walked away, and I watched them until they turned the corner, the stroller wheels clicking rhythmically against the pavement, like a metronome counting out the distance between us. That night, I dreamed of the house. In the dream, the door was open, and I stood in the hallway holding the old key. The walls breathed with the sound of the sea, though the house was nowhere near the water. When I looked down, the floor was covered in letters, notes I had written over the years, grocery lists, birthday cards, reminders, all the small evidence of a life of caretaking. As I tried to gather them, they crumbled to dust, leaving only my hands, empty and shining. I woke with tears on my face, not from sadness, but from the strange relief of finality. Some part of me knew the season of waiting had ended. A week later, I found myself standing at my desk, looking at the folder with the property documents, the ones that still bore my name. For the first time, I considered what it might mean to let go completely, not in anger, but in reclamation. I placed the folder in my bag and walked to the notary's office downtown. The clerk was a young woman with bright red nails and the distracted efficiency of someone used to dissolving other people's attachments. "You're transferring ownership?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "A donation." When she asked the recipient, I gave her the name of the women's shelter a few streets away, the one I passed every week but had never entered. As she filled out the forms, I felt an unexpected calm, like a river finally finding its course. I signed the papers slowly, each stroke deliberate, and when she handed me the receipt, I slipped it into my wallet next to my bus pass. That evening, I wrote Daniel a letter. Not an email, not a text. An actual letter on paper, the kind that takes time to unfold. I told him what I had done, that the house was no longer mine in any way, that I wished them well, that I hoped one day he would understand the difference between giving and disappearing. I ended with a single line. I want no part of a house I must knock to enter. I didn't wait for a reply. I didn't even check the mail in the days that followed. The act itself was the message. When I returned home, I opened the drawer, took out the key, and placed it on the windowsill. The metal caught the light, a small glimmer in the dusk. For the first time, it looked weightless. I left it there overnight, and in the morning, as I brewed my tea, the sunlight poured over it, turning it gold. I knew then that something irreversible had happened. Not to the house, not to Daniel or Caroline, but to me. I had stopped standing at doors waiting to be recognized. I had become, at last, the keeper of my own threshold. The day the lawyer came to collect me like an errant parcel, the sky had that pale, suspended look it gets before rain, a lid on the world that makes every sound carry. And I remember thinking, as I wiped the counter after my morning tea, that even the kettle whistled in a register that knew things were about to change. Which is to say, I had already decided that if anyone tried to fold me back into the old arrangement with the soft hands of concern or the firm grip of paperwork, the answer would finally arrive from a part of me that had been practicing its signature in the dark. He waited just inside the cafe door at noon, tall, precise, wearing a charcoal suit that had never known a bus seat, glancing at his phone as though my life were a delay he had to account for on a schedule. And when he said my name in that gentle, officious way, I knew he belonged to Caroline's theory of the world, where feelings are assets and assets are feelings, and both must be managed. We sat at a small table by the window that made a mirror of the street, and he offered me a smile designed to look disarming, introduced himself as Derek from Sorensen and Pine, representing my son and his wife with respect to your well-being and the family home, and gestured at a folder whose corners were already bent from rehearsal, then began to explain, as if reading a holiday recipe aloud, that everyone wanted what was best for me, that confusion can happen at any age, that he was here to help me consider practical steps to ensure my safety and theirs, perhaps a formal arrangement for visits, perhaps some clarity about ownership going forward, and it struck me with a humor as clean as a fresh cut that he was describing a bridge that had already been dismantled, plank by plank, while they were still standing on it, congratulating themselves for the view. I let him finish, because there is a dignity in allowing people to exhaust their scripts, then placed my palm on the cool table to feel something solid, and said, in the voice I used when a patient's family wanted antibiotics for a virus, the voice that carries care without concession, that the home no longer concerned me in any legal way, that my stake had been given to a shelter whose address he could find on the county registry by this afternoon, that I was not confused, merely finished, and that as for my well-being, it seemed staunch and measurable in the clarity of my sleep and the steadiness of my hands, which perhaps he could note in the file under the column marked "Not Negotiable." He blinked the way people do when their map evaporates, then tried to pivot toward guardianship and gentle oversight, and how the family feared I might be isolated, which is the modern word for alone, which is the old word for a woman unobserved by those who benefit from her observation. And I told him softly that a life can be full without being crowded, and that a boundary, since they liked that word so much, had at last been placed by me, around me, through me, not to keep love out, but to keep its counterfeit from draining me dry. He opened his folder as if a piece of paper might rescue him, and I watched the light fall through the condensation on his glass and realized the strangest thing. I felt no rage, not even the crisp kind that can power you through a long afternoon. I felt only an almost buoyant relief at hearing the final click of a lock I had chosen, the clean consent of my own refusal snapping into place like a well-made clasp. When he left with promises to circle back, I stayed at the window until his suit disappeared into the bright noon, and then I walked 2 blocks to the post office with an envelope I had addressed the night before, the one that had weighted like a stone in my bag, because part of me still liked to pretend there might be a different ending if I kept certain letters unsent. Inside was a single page for Daniel in my neat script, and I will tell you what it said, because the words themselves were the act. That I loved the boy I raised and wished the man he became peace. That I would not be entering a home that had been so carefully curated to exclude the smell of my soup and the sound of my keys. That I would not attend conversations whose only purpose was to reposition me as a problem to be solved, and that I was done auditioning for a role I had written with my own hands, and I closed with a promise that the door to my apartment would remain unlocked for the hours of the afternoon on Sundays, should he wish to visit alone with no camera, no lawyer, no terms, and that if he did not come, the tea would not go to waste, because I had learned to drink it hot while it was still hot. I slid the envelope across the counter, bought a stamp with a bird I could not name, and felt as if I had slid a weight off my ribs rather than a page into the maelstream. And by the time I reached the sidewalk, the sky had loosened and rain began, not angrily, but with an intention that felt companionable. I walked without hurrying, the drops stitching tiny dark blossoms across the fabric of my dress, and when I got home, I set the old brass key on the table and looked at it the way you look at a face that once altered your breathing. It looked back with no apology, only its own small history, a tool that had done its job until someone told it. Its shape was a threat, and I understood that continuing to keep it was a ritual of grief, not of hope. That evening, I heated a needle over the flame of a match, threaded a length of thin leather I had kept from an old craft kit, and pushed the needle through a ribbon of velvet I had found at the back of a drawer, making a loop, and I tied the key to it and wore it for a time around my neck, not as an amulet for entry, but as a reliquary for exit, the metal warming against my chest until it belonged to my body rather than their door. And in that small transformation, I felt the precise, pleasing sting of autonomy, a sewing of self that made every other stitch I had ever taken in the service of other people snap into a bright pattern that was finally mine. Of course, the letter reached them before the registry updated online, because speed is the consolation prize of people who do not listen. And 2 days later, my phone filled with messages that mistook urgency for intimacy. Daniel asking whether I understood the financial implications. Caroline writing from her account with a precision that could have cut glass to inform me that this was a dramatic overreach and that family disputes should be resolved in-house. The phrase so perfectly chosen, I had to sit down and smile, because I knew then that the house had become, in her mouth, a moral, a fortress, a noun that swallowed every verb. I did not answer that day, nor the next, and when a final text arrived from Daniel at dusk, "Mom, please call me," I did, and he spoke quickly, not unkindly, telling me they were hurt, that they felt blindsided, that Caroline had cried, that his in-laws were shocked, that perhaps I hadn't considered how this would look, and I listened until his words slowed, and then I told him that looking had been my assignment for his entire life, that I had considered how it would look to me if I continued to pretend I hadn't been asked to stand outside and admire a life I had paid for, and that if he wanted a mother who would keep feeding the machine that erased her, he would have to find her somewhere in his memory because she did not live at my address anymore. I said it all without heat, without raising my voice, and that calm seemed to frighten him more than any accusation. He said, after a pause, that he needed time, and I said of course. And we ended the call like two courteous strangers who had completed a transaction. The climax, if you insist on a moment rather than a movement, happened the following Sunday, when the hour I had offered arrived, and the hall clock I'd bought at a thrift store ticked its faithful wooden heartbeat toward 3, then 4, then 5, and no one came. And in the absence of footsteps, I understood that choice is not an arrow, but a threshold. And I walked into my kitchen, took the key from around my neck, opened the window, and placed it on the sill for the last of the day to warm, then set water to boil and took down the good cup, the thin china with a hairline crack that never deepens. And I poured my tea and drank it at the table with my notebook open to a blank page. And in the top corner I wrote, "I am no one's emergency exit." And the line looked at me with the friendly severity of a teacher who has refused to pass me for free. When the light ran out and the key went cool again, I stood, wrapped it in the velvet, placed it in a small wooden box that had once held my husband's cufflinks, and slid the box into the back of a drawer behind the warranties and spare bulbs, not to be hidden, but to be archived, as history rather than possibility. The next morning, I drafted a brief notice to Sorensen and Pine stating that all future attempts to negotiate my participation in a supervised relationship structure would be treated as harassment and directed to the pro bono clinic, whose lawyer had helped me file the donation paperwork without fanfare, and I mailed it with the same calm as the letter to Daniel, persuasive not because it shouted, but because it spoke in the simple declarative of a woman who had found the grammar of her life again. After that, the world did not end. The city kept breathing, the tailor downstairs kept steaming seams, the pigeons kept inventing theology from crumbs, and I walked to class with rain in my hair and the specific lightness that follows a clean cut. I had not burned a bridge so much as dismantled a gate and walked into a field that had been waiting all this time, and if sometimes the wind carried to me the faint sound of a child's laugh from a direction I could not see, I stood still and let the ache come and pass, a weather pattern rather than a verdict, knowing I had finally executed the oldest, hardest action a woman in my position can muster, not leaving, not punishing, not pleading, but removing the hinge by which other people's mercy had controlled my door and setting it on my own table, where I could decide forever after whether to install it again or keep it, small and shining, as proof that I had learned to open and close by my own hand. The quiet that followed was not the kind of quiet that punishes, nor the one that waits to be filled. It was a quiet that had texture, like linen left to dry in sunlight, full of movement and breath if you looked closely enough. I had expected grief to be the dominant color of my days after I signed away the house, but what arrived instead was a pale, surprising peace that did not ask for my permission. It began in the mornings when I woke before the alarm, when the first light entered the apartment and found everything in its place. The teacup on its saucer, the notebook on the table, the single chair by the window. It was as if the world, relieved of my constant negotiations with love, had decided to become simple again. I started to notice how even small sounds, water boiling, pages turning, footsteps in the corridor, felt like affirmations that I was still here, still capable of hearing, still capable of existing without being explained. Sometimes I think that is what peace truly is, the absence of justification. In the weeks that followed, the rhythm of my life found a new pulse, slower but steadier, as though time had finally agreed to walk beside me instead of ahead. I went back to the writing class at the community center, this time not as a student, but as a volunteer. June, the instructor, handed me a stack of notebooks and said, "You seem to know what silence can do to a person. Teach them that it isn't emptiness." We began to co-teach on Thursdays. The room filled with stories from women who had survived many versions of being told they were too much or too little. A widow learning to speak without apology, a teacher forced into early retirement, a mother whose children no longer called. I listened more than I spoke, and in their trembling sentences, I recognized the rawness of my own beginnings. Sometimes, after class, we'd stay late and share tea from a dented thermos, laughing the kind of laughter that doesn't need to be heard outside its circle. One of the women said to me once, "You sound like you forgave the world without letting it off the hook." And I told her that might be the only form of forgiveness worth practicing. One Sunday, as summer tilted toward its end, I walked to the river with a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. Inside was the wooden box that held the key, the velvet ribbon still tied around it. I sat on a bench where the path curves and watched the water move with the slow authority of something that knows it will always find a way forward. The key felt warm in my hand from the walk, its edges softened by time, and for a long moment I simply held it, remembering not the doors it had opened or refused, but the woman who had believed that opening a door for others was the same as being invited through it. Then quietly, I placed it into the river. It sank without ceremony, vanishing in a swirl of gold beneath the surface, and I thought of all the versions of myself that had waited on thresholds, and how none of them would have believed it could feel this easy to let go. After that day, Daniel called once more. His voice was hesitant, less sure of its authority. He said he had received the paperwork from the shelter, confirming the donation, and that he hoped I had done it for the right reasons. I told him, there are no wrong reasons to stop living in a house where your presence requires permission. There was a silence between us then, not hostile, but heavy with recognition. "Ethan asks about you sometimes," he said finally. He points to the photo. I asked which one, and he said, "The one where you're in the background at the wedding, holding the flowers." I smiled, unseen, and said, "That's all right. Backgrounds are where stories live before anyone notices they're the story." We ended the call politely, both aware that this was the most honest we had been with each other in years. I did not cry afterward. The tears had already been spent on smaller losses, the ones that trained me for this clarity. In early autumn, I received a letter from the shelter. They had used the money to expand their reading room, a quiet space for women waiting on paperwork, court dates, decisions. The director wrote that they had named it the Open Door Room in honor of the anonymous donor, though of course I was not anonymous, only discreet. The letter came with a photograph. A modest room, sunlight falling across mismatched chairs, a small shelf of books, a table with a vase of wildflowers. On the wall hung a plaque with a single line from my note to Daniel. I want no part of a house I must knock to enter. I laughed softly when I saw it, not from vanity, but from the strange poetry of it all, how something born of pain could end up giving refuge. I pinned the photograph above my writing desk. Sometimes, when I pause mid-sentence, I look at it and imagine the women sitting there, perhaps recognizing in those words a shape of their own story. By winter, the cold had settled like a calm heartbeat. The tailor downstairs retired, and his daughter took over the shop, filling it with bright fabrics and music that spilled gently up the stairwell. She began to leave scraps of cloth on my doorstep, florals, stripes, small gifts of color, and I sewed them into a patchwork cover for the chair by my window. The act of stitching, repetitive and rhythmic, reminded me that creation and repair are not opposites but partners. Each piece of fabric, like each year of my life, was different in texture, in history, in patience. When the cover was finished, I draped it over the chair and stood back. It looked like something that had always belonged here. Proof that even the remnants of old things can make a new shape if you give them the time and the thread. Sometimes, in the stillness of evening, I think about Caroline, about how fear can dress itself as principle, how control can masquerade as care. I do not hate her. Hatred requires energy I would rather spend on gentler pursuits. I understand her now, in the way a woman of 80 can understand another woman, still clinging to the illusion that safety can be built by exclusion. I wish her softness someday, the kind that doesn't need to police the air. If ever she reads my name in a document or hears it in passing, I hope she feels neither guilt nor triumph, only the faint tug of recognition that another woman once stood at her door and, instead of knocking, walked away whole. As for Daniel, I have stopped waiting for him to appear on Sundays, though I still leave the second cup beside mine when I brew tea, not as an invitation, but as a gesture of continuity, a silent acknowledgement that love does not vanish. It simply changes rooms. Perhaps one day he will find his way back. Perhaps he will not. Either way, I am no longer measuring my worth in arrivals. The measure is in the morning light that lands faithfully on my table, in the stories I help other women write, in the steady pulse of my own solitude. I end most evenings by writing one line in my notebook, a practice, a promise to myself that words can still hold me. Last night's line was this: peace is not given. It is chosen each time you refuse to return to a smaller version of yourself. I think of all the women who will come after me, who will hand over their keys and still expect to be let in, who will confuse generosity with admission, and I want to tell them, you are not a guest in the world you helped build. You are the foundation, the wall, the window, the light spilling through it. When someone tells you they are uncomfortable with your presence, remember that comfort has never built a single miracle. then take your quiet, your age, your uninvited tenderness, and build something that no one can lock you out of again. That, in the end, is what I have done. And if there is any justice in time, when I am gone, the wind will still move over the river where I let the key go, carrying it somewhere it can rest among the silt and stones. Proof that once a woman stopped knocking and, by doing so, finally came home.